All right, well, welcome to Soapbox Theology. Today, I just wanted to talk about the idea of God's sovereignty and how He is in control. I think it's a temptation in times like this where we're seeing the COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and when people go through times of suffering or hardship, it's a temptation to say God's not in control. It's an idea where we kind of look around and we feel like, well, God must not be the one who made this decision because it's hard, because it's difficult, and some people even go to scriptures in the Bible where God says, for example, he created man, and then did He know that Adam and Eve were going to fall? Why did He create man if He was going to allow them to fall? But the idea of God being out of control, that's easier for some people to accept. In other words, I can better worship a God who's kind of slightly aloof in that some things slip by. In other words, all catastrophe, all suffering can't really be explained through God allowing it to happen, because that in my mind that kind of knocks Him down a couple pegs. He's not so amazing if He is, in a sense, allowing certain things to happen that perhaps I disagree with or don't like. And while that's a temptation, we need to remember that the Bible is pretty clear that God is sovereign. And sovereign is the idea that God is in control. God is behind the scenes calling the shots. And He is ordaining things to happen. And while we may not always like it or be able to explain it in a way that kind of getting God off the hook for various things that bother us. So I just wanted to go through a couple scriptures tonight to hammer this point home. The first one is Ephesians 1:11. In Him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His will. So He predestines, He chooses us beforehand, which means He seems to know something beforehand. This says according to His purposes. He has purposes that He can beforehand choose, and He can therefore orchestrate these circumstances for those purposes to come about. This says He does it all according to the counsel of His will. So He's not walking, with bated breath, biting His nails, trying to figure out what's going to happen next to see what we're going to do so that He can somehow, orchestrate the situation so that it comes about to His will. I mean, you think about that. If you say that God ultimately isn't in control and He doesn't affect human free will, then what ultimately is He even in control of? The weather? He's the greatest weatherman. He can predict the weather. He can control storm. But I mean, think about it. How really sovereign and in control are you really if that doesn't involve the affairs of mankind? And I'm not even speaking about that we therefore don't have free will. We certainly do. But the Bible upholds two truths. We are responsible, we have free will, and God is in control and He's directing it. And so God is leading things according to the counsel of His will. Therefore, we ought to we ought to consider that He might have an outcome for us that we may not readily see. So that brings us to Romans 8:28. For we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. If we are called according to His purpose, God will bring about a better end towards good. And again, the idea shouldn't be that calamity happens and all God can do is respond, right? I mean, if God is not in control, then how can He ultimately even bring good out of catastrophe? Because it might just be a snowball effect, and it keeps going into worse and to worse and to worse. And at what point is, if you say that God is not in control, then when is He actually allowed to step in and bring about good? How does He do that? If He doesn't affect the affairs of man, if He isn't in control, how could He possibly bring about good? Again, by a storm? What exactly is He able to affect? Is He going to control? Send a rescue dog, and he controls nature, but human affairs, it just doesn't make sense to say that He's outside of this whole arena, which is man, who is made in His image and God has given authority to rule the earth. If God doesn't also has a say in that, then things really would be out of control. But because we know that He brings about good, He obviously is able to enter into his creation. Here's another one. Matthew 10:29 through 31. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs on your head are numbered. Fear not, therefore, for you are more valuable than the many sparrows. And so again, this is mentioning nature. Perhaps we're willing to say, well, yes, he's in control of nature. He sees the birds. He doesn't allow them to come to their end without his knowledge. But this is saying, if he cares that much for the bird, how much more does he care for you, he's numbered, right? He's numbered the hairs on our head. He knows this kind of innocuous detail about you and I, and that's how much he's aware and in control and overseeing the situation. And this is saying, therefore, don't fear. If I shouldn't fear because someone has that much knowledge and that much control, if we've been the birds, then that is hinting at telling us, I think pretty clearly, that God does have control. Things are not out of control. So there's another one, Colossians 1:16 through 17. For by him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. There's a lot of alls in that statement. But all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Does that statement make sense to then say, but God's not in control? No. Again, there's a lot of anthropomorphic language in the Old Testament where it says that God changes his mind, but I think that has to do with God is coming alongside of us, and he's trying to teach the characters, Abraham or Moses or whoever it might be, how his heart in the matter would be, is that he wants people to change. He wants them to alter course, and so that he then in turns alter his course when he says, I'm going to judge, but then they repent, and then he says, I'm not going to judge. It's not that he didn't know what he was going to do when he changed his mind. He was teaching people that he would rather show mercy than wrath, and that's literally, that gives us hints at then later down the road where we get the gospel. But if God is before all things, all things hold together, and all things were created through him, it doesn't follow to then say, oh, well, he's not actually in control. It just doesn't. Isaiah 45:7 through 9. Here's one that, depending on the translation, people might kind of really shy away from. In ESV it says, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and I create calamity. I am the Lord who does all of these things. And in some translation, it says, I make well-being and I do evil, or I allow evil. Calamity is a better explanation for it, because calamity has to do with kind of disaster and what's happening on the scene. Like, for instance, a virus going through the land. God might allow that to happen. That's not the same as, calamity is a better word than evil, because it's not moral evil. It's not like God saying, I go up to someone, I put a gun to their head and fire. He's not actively doing evil, but he allows the things that happen because he is sovereign and he has a plan. This is literally what the book of Job is all about. God allows things to happen and he brings about a greater purpose. So he does do the light, he does allow the darkness, he does do the well-being, and he does allow those situations that you and I would be tempted to say, well, no, God couldn't do that. So we kind of back away from this idea of God's in control. But God is very much in control, and again, that gives me peace and that gives me comfort, because then I can then trust that Romans 8:28. Of course he can bring about good. He's in control. He's doing something behind the scenes that I can't necessarily interpret or see, but that encourages me. That gives me hope. And that's part of the whole point of this. Because God is in control, I can have hope. Here's another one. Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. Again, pretty straightforward. The Proverbs are pretty consistent in this matter. Man makes plans, but God's the one who's directing the show. Job 42:2, when he's finally confronted with God, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Again, Job finally has to admit he wants an answer from God throughout that whole book. Finally, God shows up, and then again, God starts going through his pedigree. Where were you when I created light? Where were you when I spread out the stars? Where were you? When I took control. And he speaks over Leviathan and Behemoth and all of these ancient chaos creatures that in mythology, people view it as just chaos and out of control, and he's saying he is very much in control of all of this, and Job in the end has to admit his purposes cannot be thwarted. Here's another one. Lamentations 3:37 through 39. Who has spoken and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Again, echoing that same idea from Ezekiel. Why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins? And so again, we might want to say, this is not my fault, this kind of happened, I can't believe that I'm experiencing this blowout. And it's like, well, God has set up his universe. You sin, there's consequences. We reap what we sow. And again, it's easy to say, well, maybe this happened because of that calamity over there, or that person caused this. It's like, no, God is very much allowing these things to happen, and it's for a purpose. And again, as believers, that gives me hope, that gives me comfort. But the idea being is that God is behind the scenes. He's working, he's administrating, he's managing, he's bringing about all of these purposes. And though you and I cannot see it, and though you and I might wish it were different, that is not the point. The point is, for believers, we can have faith that God is doing something well, and because we know his nature, we can then also know that it will come about to good, and so that we can have hope and we can have faith. So I just want to encourage us a little bit with that. Even when times are challenging and we're tempted to feel like things are out of control, God is in control. God knows what he's doing. He's bringing about a purpose to his end, and because we know that he is good, as the Bible teaches us, we can rest in that truth and in that reality. And that is what we should be declaring. We should be declaring hope. We should be declaring faith. We should be experiencing peace to a level in that that's couched in the reality of God, even though current times might be tumultuous. And so it's always important for us to come back to the scriptures and let it define for us God's nature, God's character, rather than just kind of interpret the times based on how I feel or what we think is going on out in the world. That's our safest bet, and that's always what we're called to do as believers. So take comfort in the fact that God is running the show, that he loves you and I, and that he has a plan. And so that gives me hope, and I hope that gives you hope as well. Thank you so much. Continue to trust in him. Continue to look to him for what he's doing, and you will grow in gratitude as the more that you realize and the more that you begin to rely on him, rather than feel chaotic and out of control and fearful. So, thank you guys. Bye.